So we can see that the Conservative Party has made a decision. They've finally pissed rather than getting off the pot. And to wit, it is clear they've made a very assiduous decision in terms of their direction that they want to go, which I think we can probably consider to be erroneous if we are trying to be impartial. And I think there's a few points and perspectives to take here, because I think the general consensus on is she electable is of primacy. I think you always want to pick a party leader, which would necessitate winning the next election. We can delve into that. And then secondarily to this is she the representative of, or the face of the country she's supposed to be representing, and or party and or faction? We can also delve into that. And then I think the personality around what type of leader is Kemi, which I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and I don't really care enough to correct it. So the interesting part, I think, is obviously the lack of self-reflection the Tories have gone through. You can not quite comprehend how divisive and polarizing party politics can be unless you're fairly familiar with how, I would say, political parties are, obviously by necessity, but in general their lack of uniformity around things other than pre-selection. And so you have a lot of kowtowing and not so much gainsaying when it comes to certain parties or certain factions within the parties, or certain people within the factions within the parties believing and saying the things that they actually think, versus I want to be pre-selected and I want to run in the next election, therefore I'll agree with the consensus, and the consensus is obviously something that is built above them. But then you obviously have a runaway train where if there's no driver, then the direction is more or less at the whim of fate. And to some degree, I think that's where the Conservative Party is at the moment. They have let this train run on its own tracks without any guidance, and here you are. So as you can see, that historically poor election on the back of Rishi Sunak, the probably now second most incompetent Tory leader that I've ever witnessed. Obviously I'm not that old, but going through history you can see quite a many stronger, at least, and in terms of stature, grander men, and even say women here, than what you currently had on offer. Rishi being quite a weasel, and obviously the electorate felt the same, thus his embarrassing voter turnout and his, well, the Tory government's worst performance, I think, ever at an election in the modern age. Which is to say, that's on the back of that, you've got nowhere, well, you would think nowhere to go but up. That is the general, when you hit the floor, maybe there'll be the possibility for a rebound rather than what they call a dead cat bounce. And unfortunately, I think they actually are, well, they were hoping for a rebound, but even the dead cat bounce in this instance, I think, is optimistic. The personality of someone in British politics is of preeminence when it comes to electability. So the general feelings of most of the country are typically split along lines for the last 100 years, which can be considered class-based, and class very much changing from posh and peasant to white and blue collar. And so you had a transformational change there, whereby you would start to see what might have been at the start of the 20th century a bricklayer voting for Labour, to a bricklayer now probably voting for something like Reform Party, because the Labour Party went through a pivot and went and attracted very many voters from the middle of what you might call the socially progressives. And so that's people who are probably teachers, civil servants and nurses, things like this, where there's a lot of a focus on empathy, basically, as a character trait. And they try to embody this, being kind to all. And that left the Tories in the opposite side, and in a vacuum that was coalescing around certain different, you could say, motifs, but in general, there's probably more varied and quite highly contrasted political entities within the Tory party. So you have, well, traditionally, say like 20 years ago, you had conservative and old school Tories, which was much more around class and them believing themselves as upper class. You had people who were corporatists, and so you had the investment bankers and lawyers who were typically also very keen on conservative rule. Then you had farmers, and that was obviously another pact around making sure that Britain was able to still produce and maintain farms and food sources. And then you had, I think, which is probably the more bulk of the rest of the country from the middle and up, which would have been the conservative, socially conservative people. So people who see themselves maybe as Christian, or at least not very progressive from the let's all wear a rainbow flag and run down Savile Row. So now that you have that framing, you can understand how hard it has been for the Tories to actually hit messaging across all those various factions, because when you juxtapose them, they're not very similar, and it is quite difficult to maintain a core ethos that will be able to corral and coax these people into voting for you. And once you introduce something like the Reform Party, a massive splinter can be witnessed in terms of the social considerations around we don't want more immigration and we want lower taxes and support for British people and British companies, versus the Tories, who were trapped by their own, you could say, incompetence here, inability to pivot into something more meaningfully long-term and sustainable in relation to a core, as I say, ethos. And so what has happened, and the resultant voting here reflects this, is a bewildering and quite frankly inexcusable choice for a leader. So from a electoral standpoint, nobody in the world will vote for her. She'll get way less than 121 seats, and it's mind-blowing that this was even she was even considered, other than for a political purpose, was she put to the forefront. When you consider the world outside the largest urban centres, she represents almost nothing that the UK in general is reflected in. And this is not just a skin colour thing, which is obviously true still, but it's much more around her upbringing and her disposition and the way that she operates, her political beliefs. All of these things are just irrespective of how you feel about her personally. Just as a objective viewer, you can say, okay, this is not a reflection of anyone in the country. Basically, she's such a small and obscure part of society that there's no common ground to be found. And I've taken a snippet here from her, I think, website where they've gone through their messaging, and it's basically nonsensical garbage, which has probably more equivocating than I've seen in most of these, usually bromides, but the way that these advertising marketing statements usually have as a somewhat of a policy grounding, but this is all just nonsense. If you read here, so truth, we believe in truth, personal responsibility, equality under the law, family, and citizenship, which I assume that makes them think that, we believe in these things, thus the Labour Party don't. But I think they misunderstand that the dilemma they're in here is not a Labour Party versus Liberal, a Tory Conservative Party anymore. This faction civil war is between Reform and the Tories. You have a much higher risk here of Nigel Farage's party siphoning off almost all of your voters, versus I think their appeal here is like, oh, look at us compared to Labour, but that's a very generous view. Just because they're opposition today does not guarantee that they're opposition by the next election in 2029. And I have juxtaposed the current record to a previous party. So if you're not familiar, in England or in the United Kingdom, there's a, bicameral, but there's a mostly functional two-party system whereby really there's a party in charge and an opposition. And the typical way of voting is you tend toward voting for a leader and that's the cascade to the rest of the party. So in 1886, you would have picked Gladstone, and then he would have been a Liberal. And so you would have got the Liberal Party ruling, but in effect, you were voting for, even if it was not your local constituent, William Gladstone. And so all the members of the party basically must abide by his whims to a large degree. He's obviously not unchecked, and that there is a certain level of support that you must garner. But in general, if you're a favourable choice for Prime Minister, you can tend to get away in the sense of personal political opinions, it's a lot of P's, in a way that is more advantageous to you. And it has much larger requisite power compared to an equivalent position internationally, like the President of the United States is actually not as powerful as potentially you think, unless you understand the mechanism here, where he is useful for foreign affairs and some domestic politics, but the Congress and Senate still hold quite a lot of power, and as obviously juridical power is held in the Supreme Court. Whereas in the British system, the Prime Minister is a much more powerful figure from a policy and legislative perspective. In any case, you can see here the Liberal Party and how they managed to basically surrender what was their competitive edge basically inside of a century. And so you come here from 1865, where they're the first party, and by quite a lot, 369 of 658, which is, you know, more than 55% of the vote, all the way down to here where they're finishing fifth in 1918. So that is a vertiginous drop in votes and seats. And obviously you had the introduction of much broader suffrage, both for women, but also non-landed class. And then there's a much broader appeal for the world, well, the worker in the world when they come to politics, because now you have a say in a vote, and it's much easier to maintain a certain level of culture around politics if you have something in common with people. Usually that is your interests, and your interests usually are economic in a large degree and or social in a large degree. So you can see this reflected in parties who are a certain denomination of religion. Religious parties in religious states often have strong appeal. Then you have obviously worker parties in the last century, where socialism, communism were much hotter buzzwords, and you had quite a strong appeal from working class, and that's true working class, factory laborers, people out there actually sweating themselves to death, versus nowadays, which is most of the first world. There's a service-led economy, and most people who work, and if they don't work, they're on benefits, tend towards voting in very fractured interests, and that's more personal around what's best for me specifically, rather than what's best for my class or what's best for my culture. So the game has fundamentally changed, and it's very obvious that those in Westminster don't understand this to the degree that they should, because obviously you would reform, ironically enough, your entire political landscape to suit that, to win. I mean, ideally, not even ideally, the objective and the goal of a political party, the entire ambit, is to win power. If you're not suited for that, you may as well dissolve the party. It's a non-functioning instrument. And that's where we will for sure see the Tories going in the next decade, whereby I don't think that they can recover from something so catastrophic. She is unelectable, and I have no other way to put that. It would be a miracle if she's able to get through 5 years as leader of the opposition. I think they'll stick with her maybe for 18 months, and it seems very much like a last gasp of desperation here, where you try and sell everybody new Coke because you're trying to be controversial. But in politics, this is quite dangerous because you lose a lot of credibility. Consumer behaviors in economics or in financial decision-making can be short-minded. I think you can have much more leniency around bad decisions from a product perspective. But when you are talking politics, there's such a stink around certain things that they're unavoidable after a certain amount. You've seen this with Trump and the media, that they try and cloud him with all of these designations and these pejorative monikers, because once you can attribute something to someone, it's basically impossible to be rid of it. And this has been the case for politics, at least for the last 150, 200 years, but is much more evident in the social media age, where the prevalence of information and necessarily controversial information is much easier to digest by almost everybody, depending on your source of news and information. So in saying that, I think we have to understand that this unelectable woman is now the ostensible head of what is a 300-year-old political party. So all of that legacy and history and anything that's been imbued by the spirit of the party has been thrown out in the last 3 years. And this is not a degree of like just because of an Indian and now an African and now the party leader, because they're just embodiments, or they're kind of symptoms of the disease. You see these things in decay when you have a rot that's just festering. This is what you get. This is what you would call the spirit of something like the Weimar, where it's not that these are the only things that happen, it's that these are signs of a distinct change and turmoil. And she is the poster girl now of the destruction of the Tories as a political force. They are spent. This is it. There's no one for them to now appeal to. This is a unelectable woman representing what is a fractious and very internecine warring and civil war at this point party, where everyone's pulling in different directions for different things, and opposing them in the political sphere is not Labour anymore. It is Reform. And if Reform can quite truly hone and complete their mandate in a way that's appealing to that core 40% of voters who would think of themselves as traditionally conservative, then they've won it. They can for sure contest the next election to the degree that they'll finish second or third. The benefit to them at the moment really is how incompetent Straing is, because if he was a strong leader, it's quite easy to polarize the opposition. It's quite easy to form an alliance against something powerful. And I'm not a big fan of mixing my analogies from fiction to reality, but if you think of something so commonly known as say Lord of the Rings, it's easy to understand how there's an alliance of men, dwarves, and elves against something evil like Sauron and the orcs. Sauron, right? And so the idea is that, okay, well, Sauron was quite an effective leader and easy to understand why you would either be with him or against him. And this is that Carl Schmitt, friend and enemy distinction. It's much harder to consider Keir Starmer an enemy because of how incompetent he is. And it's more of a annoyance and a distaste. You find him reprehensible, but not enough to be angry about it, just enough to be annoyed. And in that, there's a rejection of a bipolarity. So you have this inability to form an oppositional power here. So we have no coherent guys, or at least no coherent monolith to stand behind. You can't say, yeah, now I'm going to be a Tory to oppose Keir, because I don't think, and most people potentially don't think, the Conservatives actually do oppose Labour, and they haven't done for, say, 20 years, where their party policies have been more or less interchangeable to a large degree. There's a facetious and, you would say, vacuous way that politics is performed now, where there's a lot of pomp and ceremony, but there's no actual distinction in the differences. You could swap the sides and the seats, and the policy is basically remaining the same. This is a death knell for a lot of politics, because you need that appeal. You need to be able to distinguish. It's like marketing in business, whereby you need to have a unique selling proposition. It's called a USP. There is no Tory USP now. Thinking that having a brown woman as your leader is a USP is so ignorant of how voting actually works, or at least popularity works, that it just smacks of this desperation. And I think that's what you'll see. Now, her stance and party obviously is very much at the whim of whatever tries to get them more votes at this stage. But once again, this is it's irrecoverable. I think they're definitely in the last gasp of what we would consider anything resembling the Tory party. And going forward, I'd be very surprised if in 15, 20 years they exist at all, if not a fourth or fifth tier electorate with the new politicians refusing to even become party members, because you have a lot of grassroots politics in the UK, and I think that should be indicative of where the care factor and the money will come from. And I don't think that once you lose certain pockets of your voting populace that you can ever recover them. There's no way to dispel this or disabuse them of this notion. And then maybe lastly is to say that this should hopefully not even come as a surprise. It can be disappointing, but I think that the Tory party has been a shambles now, as you can probably tell, since David Cameron, whereby he was coasting off the last legs of what was a traditional politics of the 20th century, to a degree where he was able to consider a referendum a bit of a perfunctory cause, whereby he would ostensibly commit to offering it, but not necessarily believe in the outcome being transformational. As you can see, the complete rejection and rebuke of the EU by the UK citizenry shows us that there is an appetite for some change and some, I would say, positive direction setting, where the laziness and the inability to provide vision by UK politics in particular is just a symptom of the laziness and the lackadaisical attitude towards helping their own denizens. So the good riddance is probably best message that you can take out of this, is that Kemi hopefully will just increase, and I'm not even an accelerationist, but she will hopefully accelerate the demise of this once illustrious party into the refuse of history, in terms of once you are incapable of understanding how to win power, you no longer deserve to even contest it.